There's a moment in music history that almost didn't happen. A room full of the biggest names in the world. Legends, icons, generational talents, crammed into a single studio after midnight. No managers, no assistants. Just the artists, the microphones, and the weight of what they were trying to do. And right above the front door, a handwritten sign: check your ego at the door. 46 of the most celebrated singers in American music walked past that sign on the night of January 28, 1985. They had gathered to record a charity single that would raise money for famine relief in Ethiopia. The project was called USA for Africa. The song was called We Are the World. You probably know how it ends. The record sold 20 million copies. It raised over $63 million. It won 4 Grammy Awards. It became the best-selling single of the entire decade. But what most people don't know, what the documentaries barely scratch the surface of, is how close the whole thing came to complete collapse, multiple times, in a single night. And at the center of every near disaster and every rescue was one man. Michael Jackson. Ask most people about We Are the World and they'll give you a version that sounds almost too perfect. A group of kind-hearted superstars who set aside their differences for one night, sang a beautiful song, and changed the world. They'll tell you it was spontaneous, organic, a natural expression of collective goodwill from the music industry's finest. They'll tell you Michael Jackson was just one of many voices in the room, a participant, not an architect. And they'll tell you the biggest obstacle was just logistics, scheduling, getting busy people to show up. But none of that is the whole story. The real story involves a song that wasn't finished until the day before the session. A studio nearly derailed by ego clashes, alcohol, an argument that almost split the room in half, and a pop icon who hadn't agreed to show up at all. It involves a Grammy-winning artist who almost brought the entire recording to a standstill because he wanted to add a language that wasn't even spoken in the country they were trying to help. It involves Bob Dylan, visibly lost, being coached on how to sing his own style by a blind man who imitated his voice note for note. And it involves Michael Jackson, who co-wrote the song, arrived hours before anyone else, and in one specific moment made a decision that determined whether the whole project lived or died. Late 1984. Harry Belafonte, the legendary activist and performer, had just watched a BBC report on the famine devastating Ethiopia. Millions of people were starving. The images were devastating. And Belafonte felt like America had gone silent. He called his manager, Ken Croghan. His message was blunt. They needed to do something, and it needed to be big. Inspired by Band Aid, the British charity supergroup that had just released Do They Know It's Christmas? Belafonte wanted an American equivalent, not a concert, a record. A record with every major name they could get in the same room at the same time. Croghan picked up the phone and called Lionel Richie. Richie was immediately on board. But a record like this needed a song first, and not just any song. It needed to be something timeless, something that wouldn't sound dated. Richie later recalled deliberately avoiding any language that would lock the song into a specific era. You can't say right on. That's the 60s, he explained. You can't say anything hip or slick. It has to be well thought out. The original plan was for Richie to co-write with Stevie Wonder. But Wonder was deep in production on his own album. So producer Quincy Jones made a different suggestion. Michael Jackson. Here's what most people assume. 2 of the biggest pop stars in the world, working together on a charity anthem, probably knocked it out quickly and moved on. The reality was more complicated. Richie showed up at Jackson's Encino home and found himself navigating a living room that doubled as a private zoo. A chimpanzee, a mynah bird, a dog, and somewhere in the background, an albino python silently rearranging the furniture. Despite the chaos, the core of the song took shape in Jackson's bedroom. Richie recalled writing on the floor. No bed, just carpet and albums along the wall. Jackson was so eager that at one point he went ahead without even telling Richie, disappeared with the melody they'd built, and came out the same night with the entire structure complete. Drums, piano, strings, and words to the chorus. LaToya Jackson later claimed her brother wrote most of the lyrics. Neither Jackson nor Richie ever publicly disagreed about the division of credit. But what multiple sources confirm is this. Quincy Jones listened to the finished demo at Jackson's house and, in his words, absolutely fell on the floor. The problem was that by the time January 28th arrived, the night of the recording session, they had only finalized the lyrics the evening before. They were still polishing the song with less than 24 hours to go. 46 artists were about to walk into a studio to record something that had technically just been finished. The date wasn't chosen by accident. Ken Croghan had realized early on that the only realistic way to get this many artists in the same city at the same time was to schedule the recording immediately after an event that would already bring them all together. The American Music Awards were being held on January 28, 1985, in Los Angeles. Lionel Richie was hosting the ceremony that same night, a ceremony where he also performed twice and won 6 awards. The moment the AMAs ended, the artists were expected to make their way to A&M Recording Studios in Hollywood. No time to decompress, no time to rest. Straight from the stage into the booth. What made the logistics even more precarious was that not everyone was in town. Stevie Wonder was still in Philadelphia that day. Bruce Springsteen had literally just ended his Born in the USA tour the night before, a grueling multi-year run, and flew to Los Angeles the same day as the session.
He told documentarians he never, ever traveled the day after a tour ended. He made an exception this once. C. YND, Eloper nearly didn't come at all. Her boyfriend had counseled her to skip it, convinced the record wouldn't be a hit. Richie found her at the American Music Awards, looked her in the eye, and told her, "It's pretty important for you to make the right decision tonight. She came. And then there was Prince. A special moment had been designed for him. A duet section where he and Michael Jackson would essentially sing to each other. In terms of raw cultural power, there may not have been a more electrifying pairing possible in 1985. Coming off the worldwide phenomenon of Purple Rain, Prince had walked into the AMAs that same night and picked up 3 trophies. He didn't walk into A&M Studios afterward. His reasoning, depending on who you ask, ranged from a claimed objection to singing a specific lyric in the existing song, to a broader discomfort with the format, to what several insiders now believe was simply the reality of his complicated rivalry with Jackson. Lionel Richie, reflecting on it decades later, was diplomatic but clear. Do you want to stop the rivalry and join a group of people singing a song, standing next to his rival? From a strictly egotistical point of view, I could see it. Prince reportedly spent the night at a restaurant on the Sunset Strip. The Jackson-Prince duet section had to be quietly removed and reworked. Kenny Loggins suggested Huey Lewis step in to take the solo directly after Jackson's section. Instead, Huey Lewis later recalled what that felt like. It was just one line, but my legs were literally shaking.
The session officially began around 10 o'clock at night. It wouldn't end until 8 in the morning. Jackson had arrived at 8, 2 hours before anyone else, to pre-record his solo section alone and lay down a vocal chorus by himself. By the time the other artists filtered in, he had already done more work than most of them would do all night. Outside the studio entrance, Quincy Jones had taped up the sign. "Check your ego at the door." It was half a plea, half a warning. He told the assembled group that night, "We do proms too, babes, loose. Fun." But also, he had exactly one night and no room for negotiating. Kenny Loggins would later say in a documentary interview, the egos were still there. Let's not pretend they weren't there. He was right. The first hours were genuinely festive. Artists laughing, joking, warming up together. Diana Ross walked over to Daryl Hall during one of the breaks and asked him to sign her lyric sheet. It triggered a chain reaction. The room's biggest names began passing the sheet around, signing autographs for each other like starstruck kids. The energy lightened noticeably. But as the clock pushed past 1 in the morning, things got complicated. Stevie Wonder, who had been Richie's original co-writing choice before Jackson stepped in, made a suggestion. He thought the chorus would be more powerful if some of it was sung in Swahili, to honor the African context of the famine they were raising money for. It wasn't an aggressive proposal. Wonder was trying to add authenticity and meaning. The room did not receive it that way. Waylon Jennings, the country legend who had been in the studio since the start, immediately balked. He wasn't alone. Several artists were exhausted, pushed past midnight, already struggling to absorb the existing lyrics. And now someone was suggesting they learn lines in a foreign language. Jennings pushed back hard enough that he briefly walked out of the studio entirely. Bob Geldof, the Irish musician who had organized Band Aid and was present that night, pointed out a fact that ended the debate. Swahili wasn't even the primary language spoken in Ethiopia. The region most devastated by the famine was Amhara speaking. The suggestion was dropped, a compromise phrase. "One world, our children," was inserted instead. Jennings returned. But the disruption had cost them time. And the solo sections, the most complex, individual parts of the recording, hadn't been reached yet. They finally began at 4 in the morning. The engineers had set up 21 microphones around the studio to capture each solo voice. Al Jarreau, the jazz vocalist, had been celebrating the evening with enough enthusiasm that he had to redo his section multiple times because he couldn't remember the lyrics. Recording engineer Humberto Gatica later recalled that Jarreau had been over the top in the alcohol section. Richie, watching wine bottles arrive at Jarreau's request, quietly started removing them one by one. "All wanted to celebrate before we had done the song," Richie said later. "Every time a bottle came in, I took a bottle back out." And then there was Bob Dylan. Dylan was, by any measure, the voice of humanitarianism in American music. His presence at the session lent the project something no other artist could provide. A lineage, a credibility that stretched back to the civil rights era. But Dylan was also a man who worked alone, rarely considered himself a conventional singer, and had never operated well inside someone else's structured format. In the footage captured that night, Dylan looks visibly uncomfortable through most of the session. Jones, trying to be encouraging, told him to just sing along naturally and kept repeating, "That's beautiful, man," with every attempt. But it was Stevie Wonder who actually solved the Dylan problem. Wonder sat down at a keyboard, played the chord sequence, and began mimicking Dylan's voice. The nasal delivery, the phrasing, the exact idiosyncratic style that had made Dylan famous. It was a musical impression precise enough that Dylan, hearing himself reflected back at him, relaxed. He found his note. He recorded his section. The room exhaled. Here's the moment that the popular version of this story almost always skips. By the time Quincy Jones finished assigning and recording the solo sections, he faced a problem that went beyond logistics. The session was running out of time. Springsteen's voice was showing the wear of the previous night's tour finale. Multiple artists were exhausted. The room's energy was fraying. And Jackson, who had arrived hours before anyone else, who had co-written the song, who had already laid down his solo, was being asked to now carry the ad-lib section at the end of the record. The outro. The emotional climax. Ad-libs, in the context of a song like this, are not improvised randomly. They require the singer to stay inside the spirit of the piece while adding something that feels spontaneous and personal. For a charity anthem with a room full of exhausted icons watching, that's an extraordinarily high-pressure moment. Jackson asked Quincy Jones a simple question before beginning. Should I say you and me or you and I? Jones thought about it. You and me, he said. It's more soulful. Jackson accepted that without argument. Then he stepped up to the microphone and he delivered. Jones called Jackson Smelly, a nickname from their years of working together that Jackson apparently found genuinely endearing. When Jackson flubbed a take, he giggled. When he got into the groove, he started dancing behind the microphone, moving his body as much as he could without disrupting the recording. But when the take mattered, his precision was absolute. What Jackson contributed to the outro wasn't just a vocal performance. It was the emotional signature that transformed a well-constructed charity record into something that felt alive. The ad-libs he laid down at the end of We Are the World are the parts most listeners remember without even realizing they've memorized them. Vocal arranger Tom Baller, who had worked with Jackson since the late 1970s, put it plainly, he was the most prepared artist I've ever worked with. He was just from another planet, so prepared, so ready. Lionel Richie, in virtually every interview he's given about this period, tells the story with warmth and genuine generosity toward everyone involved. It's his nature, and the story he tells is broadly accurate. But there are things the documentary footage shows that his public interviews tend to smooth over. The camera crew inside that night, the only media organization permitted, captured a studio far more chaotic and fragile than the polished narrative suggests. The Swahili argument was a genuine near fracture. Dylan's isolation required a private intervention to fix. Jennings walked out. Giraud had to redo his section multiple times. The room was simultaneously nervous, exhausted, territorial, and uncertain whether any of it would work. And it shows Michael Jackson not just as a participant, but as the gravitational center of the entire event. He arrived first. He recorded with precision while others struggled. When Huey Lewis was inserted into the Prince slot and had to perform directly after Jackson, Jackson personally demonstrated the line for him. Lewis recalled his legs shaking for a single note. What the footage also confirms, and what LaToya Jackson stated plainly, is that the song was primarily Michael's creation. The public credit read Jackson and Richie. That was formally accurate. But completing an entire demo alone, overnight, before your co-writer even knew it was done, that's a different kind of contribution. The session ended at 8 a.m. on January 29, 1985. Springsteen had driven himself there in a rented Pontiac GTO. Joel had kissed Christy Brinkley at the door before going in. People who had spent years as professional competitors had spent the night as something closer to family. In the early hours, while the exhaustion set in and the mood turned giddy, someone started singing Harry Belafonte's Banana Boat. The room picked it up. 46 of the most famous musicians in America, serenading the man who had started it all. Diana Ross was the last to leave. Tom Baylor heard her crying softly in another room. Quincy Jones asked if she was okay. "I don't want this to be over," she said. We Are the World was released on March 7, 1985. It sold 800,000 copies in its first 3 days. It would eventually move 20 million copies globally. It raised over $63 million for African famine relief. It was the first single ever to receive a multi-platinum certification. The story most people know is the result. The beautiful, triumphant headline. But the story that actually happened, the one captured on camera and in decades of interviews, is something else. It's a story about how close the whole thing came to unraveling. About an ego confrontation that almost split the room. About a folk legend who needed a blind man to coach him through a single verse. About a country artist who walked out and came back. About a pop rivalry so intense that the most commercially powerful artist of 1984 chose a restaurant over a charity session. And it's a story about one man who arrived early, worked harder than anyone else in the room, asked a single question. You and me, or you and I. Accepted the answer without hesitation, stepped up to a microphone, and delivered the performance that tied the whole thing together. You may not have known all of that, but the recording did. And 40 years later, it still does. Whether or not Michael Jackson is the figure you assumed him to be, the story of that night is more complicated and more interesting than the headlines ever told you.